6 months had passed since Earth sent its final message to the Galactic Council. The words were simple and clear. Humanity was done. There would be no more talks. There would be no more cooperation. The relationship that had lasted 200 years was over. Daniel Carter remembered that day very well. He had been the one to deliver those words. As the last human ambassador to the Council, he had stood before 400 alien species and told them that Earth was leaving. Some had laughed. Others had looked confused. A few had seemed worried, but none of them had truly understood what was happening. Now Daniel sat in his office in Geneva, watching reports come in from across the solar system. The aliens had not stopped trying to reach Earth. 17 diplomatic vessels had traveled to the edge of human space in the past 6 months. Each one had been turned away. There was no violence. There were no weapons fired. The ships simply could not enter. Humanity had built something the aliens called the Quiet Wall. It was a network of defense platforms that stretched across every entrance to human territory. These platforms did not attack. They did not threaten. They simply redirected any vessel that tried to pass. No matter how hard the alien ships pushed, they found themselves gently moved away, like leaves floating on a slow river. On the Council homeworld of Nexora Prime, panic was growing. Council Speaker Vorith of the Zelani Dominion called an emergency meeting. He was a tall creature with gray skin and 4 eyes that never stopped moving. For 3,000 years, his species had helped lead the Council. They had seen many crises, but they had never seen anything like this. Vorath stood before the assembly and tried to project calm, but his voice shook slightly as he spoke. The humans had not just left the Council. They had taken something with them. Something that the galaxy could not survive without. For centuries, humanity had quietly mapped the unstable wormhole networks that connected distant parts of the galaxy. These natural tunnels through space were dangerous and unpredictable. Most species avoided them entirely. But humans had studied them with patience and care. They had learned which ones were safe and which ones would tear a ship apart. They had created detailed maps showing the fastest routes between star systems, and they had shared this knowledge freely. The Council had accepted this gift without much thought. The maps were useful, certainly, but they came from humans, and humans were considered a lesser species. Their contribution was noted but never truly appreciated. Now, those maps were gone. Every copy had been erased from Council databases. Every human navigator who knew the routes had returned to Earth. And the galaxy suddenly realized how much it had depended on those primitive little creatures from that unremarkable yellow star. Lisa. Morgan had been preparing for this moment for years. As the Secretary of Terran Defense, she had overseen the construction of the Quiet Wall in complete secrecy. The Council had always underestimated human technology. They believed their sensors could detect anything. They were wrong. Lisa reviewed the latest intelligence reports in her office in Washington. The situation in Council space was getting worse every day. Trade routes that once took weeks now took months. Ships had to travel the long way around through normal space, because the wormhole shortcuts were too dangerous without human maps. 3 species had already declared economic emergencies. The Varix Collective was hit hardest. They were proud traders who had built their entire civilization on commerce. For generations, they had mocked human technological progress. They had called humanity a young and foolish species that would never amount to anything. Now their trade empire was collapsing, and they had no idea how to stop it. Ambassador Salaith of the Corvani paced in her chambers on Nexera Prime, trying to understand what had gone wrong. Her species had been among those who voted to punish humanity after the Kepler-7 incident. She remembered the debates clearly. Human colonists had been attacked by raiders on a small world at the edge of Council space. They had called for help. Council forces were nearby, but the commanders had refused to act, claiming that the situation was outside their jurisdiction. By the time anyone arrived, 8,000 humans were dead. Men, women, and children slaughtered while Council ships sat idle just a few light years away. Humanity had demanded justice. They had demanded that those responsible be punished. Instead, The council had issued a statement expressing regret and closed the matter. When humans protested, they were sanctioned for disrupting council proceedings. Scythe had voted for those sanctions. It had seemed reasonable at the time. The humans were being emotional. They needed to understand how the council worked. Rules were rules. Jurisdiction was jurisdiction. These things could not be changed just because some colonists had died. Now she wondered if that vote had been a terrible mistake, back on Earth. Michelle Harris addressed the Global Assembly in New York. She was the leader of the Terran Isolation Committee, the group that had planned humanity's departure from galactic affairs. She was a small woman, with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She explained to the assembly that, humanity had given the galaxy enough chances. 200 years of council membership had brought nothing but pain. Every time humans created something new, the council scientists called it primitive. Then, years later, those same scientists would quietly adopt the technology without giving any credit. Every time humans asked for equal treatment, they were told to wait. Every time human colonies were attacked, the council found a reason not to help. Christopher Lane stood beside Michelle, holding a thick folder of documents. He was a historian who had spent a decade gathering evidence of how the council had treated humanity. The folder contained thousands of examples. Stolen inventions, broken promises, dead colonists whose killers were never caught. The council had treated humanity like useful pets. They gave humans small tasks and expected gratitude. They took what they wanted and offered nothing in return. They smiled and nodded and made promises they never intended to keep. But pets sometimes run away. And when these particular pets left, they took the keys to the house with them. Daniel Carter turned off his screen and looked out the window at the evening sky. Somewhere out there, beyond the stars he could see, the galaxy was falling into chaos. Species that had ignored humanity for centuries were now desperate to talk. Leaders who had laughed at human ambassadors were now begging for meetings. It was too late. Earth had made its decision. The door was closed, and humanity would decide if it ever opened again. The universe had taken Earth for granted. Now the universe would learn what it meant to live without the species it had so carelessly dismissed. The panic was just beginning, and Daniel knew that things would get much worse before they got better. He allowed himself a small smile. For the first time in 200 years, humanity was free. Commander Kevin Brooks stood on the bridge of the Terran vessel, resolute, and watched the chaos unfolding beyond the quiet wall. His ship was positioned at the edge of human space, close enough to observe, but far enough to remain safe. Every day brought new reports of disasters in Council territory. The Varix Collective had lost 40% of its trade fleet in the past 3 months. Without human maps to guide them, their ships had tried to navigate the wormhole networks on their own. Some had made it through. Many had not. The wormholes were unpredictable things, shifting and changing without warning. What was safe one day could be deadly the next. Only human navigators had learned to read the signs. Kevin watched a Varix cargo vessel drift past his position. It was heading toward the quiet wall, moving slowly, almost hesitantly. The ship stopped just outside the boundary and transmitted a message. The words were translated instantly on his screen. "Please, we need medicine. Our colonies are dying. We will pay anything." Kevin felt nothing. He had served in the Colonial Defense Force for 20 years. He had been at Kepler 7. He had arrived 3 days after the massacre, when the bodies were still being counted. He remembered the smell. He remembered the silence. He remembered the small shoes lined up outside a schoolhouse that would never open again. The Varix had sold weapons to the raiders who attacked Kepler 7. Everyone knew it. The council had investigated and found no evidence. The investigation had lasted 2 days. Kevin watched the cargo vessel wait for an answer that would never come. After an hour, it turned and flew away. On Nexira Prime, the council chamber had become a place of fear. Species that had worked together for thousands of years were now pointing fingers at each other. Old alliances were breaking apart. Old enemies were remembering old grudges. Ambassador Scythe of the Corvani tried to calm the assembly. But no one was listening. The Zilani blamed the Corvani for pushing the humans too hard. The Corvani blamed the Variks for their secret dealings with raiders. The Variks blamed everyone but themselves. Speaker Vorith called for order, but his voice was lost in the shouting. For the first time in recorded history, the council session had to be suspended due to chaos. Salaith returned to her chambers and sat alone in the dark. She had spent her entire career believing in the council. She had believed that it represented the best of galactic civilization. Now she saw it for what it truly was. A group of old species clinging to power, terrified of change, willing to sacrifice anyone to maintain their comfort. She thought about the humans she had met over the years. They had always seemed so eager, so hopeful. They had come to the council believing they would find friends among the stars. Instead, they had found masters who pretended to be equals, back on Earth. Michelle Harris continued her work with the Terran Isolation Committee. Every day, her team received hundreds of messages from alien species begging for contact. Some offered money. Some offered technology. Some offered things that could not be translated into human concepts. Michelle ignored them all. She had a list of conditions that any species would need to meet before Earth would even consider talking. The list was long. It included full acknowledgement of past wrongs. It included payment for damages. It included fundamental changes to how the species operated. So far, no one had met even the first condition. Christopher Lane brought her another report. This one documented a new development. Several council species were trying to create their own wormhole maps. They had sent hundreds of research vessels into the networks, hoping to learn what the humans knew. The results were predictable. Most of the vessels never returned. The few that survived brought back data that was incomplete and contradictory. The wormholes were simply too complex, too chaotic for anyone to understand quickly. Humanity had spent 300 years mapping them. The council species were trying to do the same work in months. Michelle read the casualty figures without emotion. Thousands of alien lives lost. Billions of credits wasted. And they were no closer to solving their problem. She wondered if they would ever understand. The maps were not the point. The maps were a symptom. Humanity had succeeded because humans never stopped learning, never stopped questioning, never stopped trying to understand the universe around them. The council species had stopped centuries ago. They had decided they knew enough. They had become comfortable. And comfort was death to progress. Kevin. Brooks received new orders from Earth. He was to take the Resolute on a tour of the border regions. His mission was simple. Observe and report. Do not engage. Do not respond to any communications. Let the aliens see that humanity was watching, but would not participate. He set course for the Kepler sector. It was a long journey, but he wanted to see the place again. He wanted to see what had become of the world where so many of his friends had died. When he arrived, he found the planet abandoned. The colony had never been rebuilt. The buildings were still standing, empty and silent. Nature was slowly reclaiming what humans had built. Grass grew through cracks in the streets. Birds nested in broken windows. Kevin landed his shuttle near the old town center. He walked through the empty streets alone, his footsteps echoing off the walls. He found the schoolhouse. The small shoes were gone. Someone had collected them, probably for burial. But the building remained a monument to council indifference. He stood there for a long time, remembering faces he would never see again. Then he returned to his ship and continued his mission. The galaxy was learning a hard lesson. For 200 years, they had treated humanity as servants. They had taken everything and given nothing. They had ignored human suffering and dismissed human achievements. They had believed that humans would always be there, always ready to help, always willing to forgive. They were wrong. Lisa Morgan received reports from every sector of human space. The quiet wall was holding perfectly. Not a single alien vessel had penetrated the boundary. The automated systems were working exactly as designed. Humanity was safe, but safety was not the goal. The goal was change. The goal was to force the galaxy to recognize what it had done. The goal was to make the old species understand that they could not continue treating younger races like property. Lisa did not know. If the plan would work, perhaps the council would collapse entirely. Perhaps new powers would rise from the chaos. Perhaps the galaxy would burn. She did not care. Whatever happened next, humanity would face it on its own terms. The universe had made its choice when it abandoned Kepler 7. Now Earth had made its choice in return. The relationship was over. The ties were cut, and nothing would ever be the same again. High Commander Torvax of the Zalani military stood before the council assembly and made his proposal. His voice was cold and certain. Diplomacy had failed. Economic pressure had failed. There was only one option left. The humans needed to be reminded of their place in the galaxy. He projected images of his fleet onto the chamber's viewing screens. 800 warships, the largest military gathering in council history. Battle cruisers the size of small moons. Fighters that could move faster than light. Weapons that could crack planets open like eggs. The Zalani had not fought a major war in 6,000 years. But they had never stopped building weapons. They had never stopped training soldiers. They believed that strength was the foundation of civilization. And now they would use that strength to bring humanity back into the fold. Some council members objected. Ambassador Salaith of the Corvani warned that the humans might be more dangerous than they appeared. She reminded the assembly that no one truly knew what Earth was capable of. For 200 years, humans had been quiet and cooperative. Perhaps that cooperation had hidden something darker. Torvax dismissed her concerns with a wave of his massive hand. The humans were clever, he admitted, but clever was not powerful. Their ships were small. Their weapons were primitive. They had no experience with real warfare. They would see the Zalani fleet and understand that resistance was pointless. The council voted. The measure passed. The fleet would move against human space in 3 days. On Earth, Amanda Price received the intelligence report within hours. She was the tactical advisor to Secretary Morgan, responsible for predicting enemy actions and preparing responses. She had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Amanda had studied the Zalani for 20 years. She knew their tactics, their strategies, their weaknesses. They were powerful, yes. Their technology was advanced by galactic standards. But they had one critical flaw. They had never fought an enemy. They did not. Understand, every war the Zalani had ever won was against species they had studied for centuries. They knew their opponents perfectly. They knew how they thought, how they moved, how they reacted to fear. Against such enemies, the Zalani were unstoppable. But they did not know humans. They had dismissed humanity as too primitive to study seriously. They had never watched human wars. They had never analyzed human tactics. They saw only the peaceful faces that humans showed to the galaxy. They had no idea what lay beneath. Amanda presented her analysis to the Defense Committee. The Zalani would attack with overwhelming force, expecting a quick surrender. When the humans did not surrender, they would become confused. They had no plan for extended conflict. They had no experience with an enemy that would not break. Secretary Morgan approved the defense protocols. The quiet wall would handle the first contact. If the Zalani persisted, additional measures would be activated. Measures that the Council had never imagined. Existed. Patrick Sullivan commanded. The human defense grid from a station orbiting Mars, he was a quiet man who had spent his career working on projects that officially did not exist. The defense platforms of the quiet wall were his creation. But they were only the beginning. For 200 years, humanity had developed technology in secret. Every time they shared an invention with the Council, they kept the next generation hidden. The Council saw version 1 and called it primitive. Meanwhile, humans were already working on version 10. The gap between what the galaxy knew and what humanity actually possessed was enormous. Patrick sometimes wondered what the aliens would think if they saw the truth. Probably they would be afraid. That was the point. The Zalani fleet crossed the boundary into human space on a clear Tuesday morning. 800 ships moved in perfect formation, their weapons powered and ready. Commander Torvax led from his flagship, the Dominion's Fury. A vessel larger than most space stations, he expected to find human ships waiting for him. He expected some kind of defense fleet, perhaps a few dozen vessels trying to look brave. He would destroy them quickly, and then proceed to Earth. The whole operation would take less than a week. What he found instead was nothing. Empty space. No ships, no stations. No visible defenses of any kind. Just the silent darkness between stars. Torvax frowned. This was not what he had expected. Were the humans hiding? Were they hoping to ambush his fleet? He ordered his sensors to maximum range and began scanning for any sign of enemy presence. The sensors found nothing, but the sensors were wrong. The attack came without warning. One moment, the Zilani fleet was moving forward confidently. The next moment, half the fleet could not move at all. Something had grabbed them, some invisible force that held their ships in place like insects trapped in amber. Torvax shouted orders. His officers tried to respond, but their controls were useless. The engines fired at full power, but the ships did not move. Weapons targeted empty space, but there was nothing to shoot at. Then the gravity waves began. Patrick Sullivan watched from his station as the defense platforms did their work. The technology was simple in concept, but impossible for anyone else to build. Focused gravity manipulation. The ability to create zones of intense gravitational force at any point in space. The Zilani ships were not being attacked. They were being held. And then they were being crushed. Not destroyed, not damaged, but squeezed just enough to disable their systems. Engine cores overloaded under the pressure. Weapon systems failed. Life support struggled, but survived. The battle lasted for minutes. When it was over, 700 Zilani vessels drifted helplessly in space, their crews alive, but powerless. The remaining 100 ships, including the Dominion's Fury, fled at maximum speed. Torvax escaped with his life, but his pride did not survive. He had brought the greatest fleet in Council history against a species everyone considered primitive. He had been defeated in minutes without seeing a single enemy ship. On Nexira Prime. The news spread across the planet within hours. The Zilani, the mightiest military power in the galaxy, had been crushed by invisible weapons. The humans had technology that the Council had classified as impossible. Theoretical concepts that scientists said would not be developed for 1,000 years. The humans had built them anyway. Speaker Vorath addressed the Council in emergency session. His voice was weak. His hands trembled. The universe they had known was gone. Everything they believed about humanity was wrong. And now they had to face a terrible question. If the humans had hidden this much power, what else were they hiding? And what would happen if they decided to use it not for defense, but for revenge? The chamber fell silent. For the first time in millennia, the Great Council had no answer. Fear had come to the ancient races, and it would not leave easily. Nicole Adams had spent 20 years studying alien civilizations. She was a xenoanthropologist, an expert in understanding how different species thought and behaved. For most of her career, she had worked quietly, gathering data, writing reports that few people read. Now the entire planet was listening. She stood before the Terran Isolation Committee and presented her final analysis. The room was silent as she spoke. What she had discovered would change everything humanity believed about the galaxy. The ancient species of the Galactic Council had stopped evolving, not physically, but mentally. Their societies had reached a peak thousands of years ago and then frozen in place. They no longer created new ideas. They no longer solved new problems. They simply repeated the patterns that had worked before. Over and over again, forever, Nicole showed the committee her evidence. The Zilani had not invented a new weapon system in 4,000 years. The Corvani had not developed a new art form in 6,000 years. The Variks had not created a new trade practice in 8,000 years. Every advancement they claimed came from younger species. Species they had recruited, used, and eventually discarded. The Council was not a community of equals working together for mutual benefit. It was a machine for stealing ideas from creative species and giving nothing in return. Humanity had been the latest victim, but they were not the first. Dozens of species had come before, each one drained of its innovations and then pushed aside. Christopher. Lane added his historical research to Nicole's analysis. He had found records of species that no longer existed, not destroyed by war or disaster, but simply faded away after the Council took everything they had to offer. Their names survived only in old archives. Their cultures, their achievements, their dreams were all forgotten. Humanity had been heading toward the same fate. The Council had been patient. They knew that draining a creative species took time. You could not rush the process. You had to let them believe they were valued. Let them share their ideas willingly. Let them exhaust themselves, trying to earn respect that would never come. The Kepler-7 massacre had changed everything. It had opened human eyes to the truth. The Council did not see humanity as partners. They saw them as resources to be exploited, and when those resources became troublesome, they could be sacrificed without concern. Secretary Morgan asked Nicole the question that everyone was thinking. Could the ancient species change? Could they learn to innovate again? Could they become true equals instead of parasites? Nicole shook her head slowly. Her research suggested that the stagnation was permanent. The Council races had become dependent on stealing ideas because they had forgotten how to create their own. Their minds had settled into fixed patterns that could not be broken. They were like addicts who could not imagine life without their drug. Stephen Grant, the Terran president, addressed the Global Assembly later that day. He was a tall man with gray hair and a voice that carried the weight of difficult decisions. He explained to the people of Earth what humanity had learned. The galaxy was not what they had imagined. The ancient civilizations were not wise elders, guiding younger species toward greatness. They were dying empires desperately trying to postpone their end by feeding on fresh minds. Humanity had been chosen not because it was respected, but because it was creative. The Council had seen human potential and wanted to consume it. President Grant made a promise to his people. That consumption would never happen. Humanity would protect its creativity, its innovation, its future. They would not allow themselves to be drained by species that had given up on progress. Sandra Collins was a journalist, stationed at the border outposts. Her job was to document the changes happening in Council space since humanity's departure. What she saw amazed her. The Great Alliance was falling apart. 3 species had already withdrawn from the Council entirely. They had concluded that the organization was dying and wanted no part of its collapse. A dozen more were quietly negotiating private arrangements. Trying to position themselves for whatever came next, the Corvani ambassador Salaith had done something unprecedented. She had publicly acknowledged her species' role in the mistreatment of humanity. She had apologized, not with the empty words of a diplomat, but with genuine shame in her voice. Her own government had tried to silence her. She had refused. Sandra interviewed Salaith through a carefully arranged communication channel. The ambassador spoke honestly about what she had witnessed inside the Council. The fear was overwhelming. Species that had felt secure for millennia were now terrified. They had built their entire civilization on a foundation of stolen ideas. That foundation was crumbling. Some were angry at humanity. They blamed the humans for abandoning them, as if Earth had some obligation to continue feeding creatures that had never shown gratitude. Others were angry at themselves, finally seeing the truth of what they had become. A few, like Salaith, were trying to find a new path. Michelle Harris reviewed the requests for contact that continued to arrive every day. The tone had changed. Early messages had been demanding, entitled, full of threats and complaints. Now they were desperate, pleading, sometimes pathetic. One message caught her attention. It came from a species called the Trinari, a small civilization that had never been part of the Council. They had watched humanity's departure with interest. They had seen what the ancient races truly were, and they wanted to talk, not to beg for help, but to offer friendship. Michelle forwarded the message to the committee. Perhaps there were species in the galaxy worth knowing. Perhaps humanity could build new relationships based on genuine respect. But that would come later. First, the old order had to finish dying. Nicole Adams concluded her report with a prediction. The Council would collapse completely within 5 years. The species that depended on it would have to learn self-sufficiency or perish. Some would adapt. Many would not. The The galaxy was entering a period of transformation that would last centuries. When the chaos finally settled, a new order would emerge, and humanity would be there, not as victims or resources, but as builders of something better. The age of parasites was ending. The age of true partnership could finally begin, but only if Earth chose to make it so. The future remained unwritten, and humans had always been good at writing new stories. 1 year had passed since Earth severed its ties with the Galactic Council. In that time, everything had changed. The Great Alliance that had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years existed only in name. Its halls were empty. Its decisions were ignored. Its power had evaporated like water in the sun. 14 species had officially withdrawn from the council. Their ambassadors had packed their belongings, made polite speeches about new directions, and returned home. Many more had simply stopped participating. They still held seats in the assembly, but those seats remained empty, meeting the Zilani Dominion. The Zilani Dominion faced internal rebellion for the first time in recorded history. The military defeat at human hands had shattered the myth of Zilani superiority. Common citizens who had always accepted their leaders now asked difficult questions. Why had the commanders been so foolish? Why had they underestimated the humans so completely? Why should anyone trust leaders who made such terrible mistakes? High Commander Torvax had been removed from his position. He lived now in quiet exile on a remote colony, forbidden from speaking publicly about what had happened. The government hoped that silence would help people forget. But people did not forget. They remembered the images of 700 warships drifting helplessly in space. They remembered the shame. Daniel Carter returned to diplomacy, but everything was different now. He was no longer a representative, begging for attention at council meetings. He was the voice of a civilization that the galaxy suddenly realized it needed desperately. His first meeting took place on a human station at the edge of the solar. The station was called Gateway, and it had been built specifically for this purpose. Aliens who wanted to speak with humanity would come here. They would not enter human space. They would wait at the door and ask permission. The first visitors were the Corvani. Ambassador Salaith led a small delegation, just 3 individuals, across the docking bridge. Her steps were slow and careful. She knew that every movement was being watched, analyzed, judged. Daniel greeted her with formal courtesy. He offered no warmth, no smiles, no pretense of friendship. Those things would have to be earned. For now, this was business. Salaith presented her proposal. The Corvani wanted to establish independent relations with Earth, separate from any council involvement. They would acknowledge past wrongs in writing. They would pay compensation for damages caused by their actions. They would open their archives so humanity could see exactly how decisions had been made over the past 2 centuries. Daniel listened without interruption. When she finished, he asked a single question. Why should Earth believe anything the Corvani said? Salaith had prepared for this. She handed him a data crystal containing evidence that her own government had tried to destroy. It documented secret meetings where council leaders had discussed how to manage the human problem. It showed that the Kepler-7 massacre had been allowed to happen deliberately. The raiders had been paid to attack. The council forces had been ordered to stand down. The massacre was not negligence. It was murder. And the Corvani had been part of the conspiracy. Daniel took the crystal without expression. He told Salaith that her offer would be considered. Then he ended the meeting. The Corvani delegation returned to their ship and waited. Lisa Morgan reviewed the evidence that night. It confirmed what humanity had long suspected but could never prove. The ancient races had wanted to hurt Earth. They had wanted to remind humans of their place. They had sacrificed 8,000 lives to send a message. The message had been received, but the response was not what the council had expected. Secretary Morgan expanded the Terran Defense Network to cover every approach to human space. The gravity manipulation platforms were joined by new systems, technologies that made the original quiet wall seem primitive. If anyone ever tried to attack Earth again, they would face weapons that could tear apart entire fleets without breaking a sweat. But defense was only part of the plan. Lisa also oversaw the construction of new exploration vessels. Ships designed to venture beyond council space, into regions the ancient races had never bothered to visit. Humanity would not hide forever. Eventually, they would expand again. And this time, it would do it on their own terms. Michelle Harris presented the Terran Doctrine to the Global Assembly on a cool autumn morning. The document was short and clear. Earth would engage with alien species again, but only those who met strict conditions. First, any species seeking contact must acknowledge humanity as an equal. Not in empty words, but in binding agreements with real consequences for violation. Second, any species with a history of harming humans must provide full accounting of their actions. Names of those responsible, records of decisions made, evidence that could not be hidden or destroyed. Third, all interactions would be based on genuine reciprocity. Earth would share knowledge only with those who shared equally in return. The days of humanity giving freely while receiving nothing were over. The doctrine was not about revenge. It was about self-respect. Humanity had learned a painful lesson about trusting those who saw them as inferior. That lesson would not be forgotten. Commander Kevin Brooks watched the first alien vessels arrive under the new protocols. His ship, the Resolute, was stationed near Gateway to observe the process. He had expected to feel anger when he saw alien faces again. Instead, he felt something closer to pity. The Corvani delegation had returned with their government's official acceptance of humanity's terms. They disembarked from their ships slowly, almost fearfully. These were not the arrogant creatures who had dismissed human concerns for 2 centuries. These were humbled beings who had finally understood what they had lost. Saleth approached the human welcoming committee and did something that shocked everyone watching. She knelt. In Corvani culture, this was the deepest form of submission. It meant acknowledging absolute error. It meant accepting complete responsibility. It meant begging for a forgiveness that might never come. Kevin watched through his ship's sensors. He thought about Kepler-7. He thought about his friends who had died there. He thought about the Council forces that had refused to help. And he felt something shift inside him. The humans on Gateway did not make Saleth remain on her knees. They helped her stand. They guided her delegation to the meeting rooms. They began the long, difficult process of building something new. Earth had not abandoned the universe. It had simply reminded the universe that humanity was never the lesser species in the room. The panic that swept through galactic civilization was not caused by human aggression. It was caused by the sudden, terrifying realization that the quiet little species from the unremarkable yellow star had been the only thing holding everything together. The wormhole maps, the new technologies, the fresh ideas, the endless creativity, all of it had come from humanity. All of it had been taken for granted. And now the galaxy understood what life was like without it. Daniel Carter stood at the observation window of Gateway Station, looking out at the stars. Somewhere in that darkness, old empires were crumbling. New powers were rising. Species were learning painful lessons about respect and cooperation. It would take generations for the damage to heal. Perhaps it never would fully. But humanity had survived. Humanity had won. And humanity would decide what came next. The door to the galaxy remained closed to most. But for those willing to change, willing to learn, willing to treat others as equals, it might one day open again. Until then, Earth would wait. Patient, powerful, free. The universe had finally learned to pay attention.